Alright, everybody, hello and welcome to my Overwatch League fan thoughts and analysis series. Today is a special video as we are getting into the first part of my Overwatch League Season 2 Power Rankings, the preseason Power Rankings, to prepare for the start of the season next week. Before I start the video, I just want to say a few things. The first thing is that I'm sorry once again for this video being late. If you didn't see the video that went up when this video was supposed to go up, I just kind of explained what was going on, and I unfortunately could not salvage the other version of this video, so I have to do it all over again. I'm doing it slightly differently, so hopefully it works this time, and works well, but I can't guarantee that that's the case, but I'm hoping it goes well. The second thing is I am still sick, so my voice may sound a little nasally and clogged and whatnot, so hopefully it's not too bad. I'm hoping that by Friday it's all gone, so when I do the next video it's not a problem, but I can't guarantee that'll be the case. The third thing that I want to talk about is the rankings in general. Of course, this is my list. These are my opinions, so the way I view the power rankings is going to most likely be different from the way that you and other people view them. And the reason why is because I'm not doing this based on who I think is, 20 is the worst team and 1 is the best team. It's related to that, of course, but at the end of the day, I am ranking this based on the teams that I think have the best chance at winning the season, right? Winning the grand finals, okay? That's what I'm looking at. And to me, that is slightly different than what you would have if you just said the 20 best teams. Because a team like last year, London Spitfire, were not the best team going into the season, although some people may have argued they were. And they weren't the best team throughout the season, but they won the whole thing because they prepared well and they prepped well and they had that talent and they had enough time that they could be that team. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at. It's not necessarily just going to be the best team at number 1. It's not necessarily going to be the worst team at number 20, though it is definitely related. So with that being said, I want to jump into these rankings and start at number 20 with the Chengdu Hunters. Now, the Chengdu Hunters are a somewhat problematic team to me. The biggest thing for me is that this team has 2 players, Bacon Jack and Yang Xiaolong, who haven't really been playing professional Overwatch recently. This is kind of their first trip back into professional Overwatch. Yang Xiaolong and Bacon Jack were trying to get in the Overwatch League last year and did not make it, and then switched to playing PUBG professionally instead of Overwatch, so that to me is a little concerning for 2 reasons. One, they haven't really been in the pro scene recently, so the way the meta has changed and whatnot, I don't know how used to it they'll be. And the other thing, which is the thing I'm more worried about, is the fact that they don't have, in my eyes, necessarily an attachment to the game as the way that other players might. If the game starts getting frustrating and they start to kind of burn out, they're going to definitely be like, yeah, well, this is why I left, right? I wasn't enjoying the game. I feel like they're kind of in this point where there's not really a large chance, in my opinion, that they will do this, right? I don't think this is something that will happen, but I think it's definitely a possibility that if Chengdu struggles, which I don't think that's the only reason why Chengdu would struggle. I think this roster is relatively unknown, with the exception of Yveltal, Late Young, and then Yang Xiaolong and Bacon Jack themselves. I think that this roster is relatively weak. I don't think it's Shanghai Dragons level weak. I think Shanghai Dragons were far worse than this roster is. But part of me, just the Chengdu Hunters roster doesn't really scream to me. And one of the kind of like cherries on top is that Yang Xiaolong isn't even in the country because he couldn't get his visa. His visa got denied. And they just signed another tank player. I want to mention that because I think that is good. They have at least 2 players in each position now, which I think is perfect. But they're not going to have potentially their star DPS when the season starts in Yang Xiaolong. I don't know if that'll be a problem, whatnot. I'm just, there are things with the Chengdu Hunters that I'm very concerned about, and I'm kind of questioning them in a lot of ways. I think they'll be most likely fine. I really don't think there's any teams this season that'll be just absolutely terrible in the same way that the Shanghai Dragons were last year, where they didn't win a single game. I think that the way the league is built this season, there are so many teams that are kind of close together in terms of skill that I think every team will win at least a game. But I think that when you look at the Chengdu Hunters roster, to me, it's the weakest roster out there. I still think it's not horrible when it comes to a pro Overwatch roster, but I need to see this roster perform well because a full Chinese roster did well at the World Cup. So obviously, I believe that the Chinese players have the skill they need and the talent, but I need to see them perform well in the Overwatch League. And while I believe they have the talent they need and they have good players, to me, those good players don't counteract the weaknesses I see in this roster, some of the players I don't really like, and that's why I have them down here at number 20. Number 19, we're going to go across the Pacific and across the country of the United States to Washington, where we look at the Washington Justice. I have the Washington Justice here at number 19 for a couple of reasons. The first reason is I'm not a huge fan of the way this roster breaks down. You have 5 South Korean players and 3 players from the United States. My issue with this is you have a number of players that means you have to have at least one player on the roster playing at any moment that isn't a Korean player. And that player is going to be in the DPS role, most likely. They will be, because the only DPS player they have currently that is Korean is Otto, formerly of the Shanghai Dragons. So you're going to be seeing either Corey or Stratus playing, neither of whom I was really impressed by. Corey, I watched him, I was kind of underwhelmed. Stratus I thought was a little bit better, but he seemed to pretty much only play Pharah at a level that I thought was pretty good, so I look at that and I get a little worried. Fozix, I don't think will play very much. He's in that support role, so I think that for the most part it'll be a South Korean roster with one American player playing, who to me isn't a very impressive player anyway, so I'm a little concerned about that. One of the things I like about this team, and I'll give this team credit, is I think they made 2 of the best signings you could make with their head coach in Wizard Hyong, and in the main tank role with Janus, or Jonas, or Janus, I don't really know how you pronounce it, and he used to be on New York Excelsior, and I still don't know. I thought those 2 signings were great. They have some Overwatch League experience elsewhere on the roster with Otto and Guido. Otto, of course, from the Shanghai Dragons, as I just mentioned, and Guido coming from the Seoul Dynasty. So they have some Overwatch League experience, but I look at some of these other players, the other 2 players on the roster, Hyunwoo and Sansam, both South Korean players who I have seen very little on because I couldn't really find anything on these people, because they played on some really bad and unknown Overwatch League teams, or Overwatch Contenders teams, before coming into the Overwatch League. So I don't really know much about this team, but one of the reasons why I give this team more of an advantage than the Chengdu Hunters is Wizard Hyong as their head coach. I believe in him as a head coach. He was one of the main reasons why the New York Excelsior were super successful, or at least a big part of it. And they have that Overwatch League experience in Janus and Otto and Guido, so they have experience and in both players and in the coaching. That to me gives me some hope, and I also think that they're in the easier division than the Chengdu Hunters are. I think the Pacific Division is harder than the Atlantic Division. So in that way, I think Washington can manage to get some other wins in there than we'll see Chengdu get. But at the end of the day, I don't really see Washington as a title contender because I think they have weaknesses in their DPS, specifically in their American DPS players, and I think that their support line is going to be subpar. I think their tank line will be pretty good. I don't really know much about Sansam, but I trust Janus with a more aggressive team, which this team looks to be more aggressive. So I don't think this team is going to be the team that I expected them to be when they first started out with announcing Janus and Wizard Hyong as part of the team, but I think they will still be good and they'll still see some levels of success, but I don't think they're going to be really fighting for the cup or the title. I think they have too many issues with some of their talent that they will struggle. So that's my thoughts, though, on the Washington Justice. We're going to move on now to my number 18 team, which is the Florida Mayhem. Now, I will say this about the Florida Mayhem. I think they are a much, much, much better team than they were last season. The problem is, I still don't think this team is incredible. And one of the issues I have with this team currently is this team is a predominantly South Korean team now. The exceptions, of course, being Tavik in the DPS role and Apply, who is a two-way player from the United States. So he'll be playing mostly in Mayhem Academy. I look at this team's roster and I'm like, okay, that's interesting. One of the issues is there's not a single person on this team in the management that is from South Korea. There was somebody, they got rid of them. Their head coach is Mineral, who is their head coach last season. The team wasn't that good last season, and he's still with them. So I look at a lot of these teams and a lot of these players, and I think they're okay. I really love Sai player. I think he's a fantastic player. He was one of the players I enjoyed watching the most in Season 1 of the Overwatch League. You have Awesome Guy, who is now SNT. I think he's pretty good. Not incredible, but he's pretty good. Tavik is a decent player. I'm sure he'll play just fine. Then they add Zephyr, who was not great for the Seoul Dynasty. He was on the Seoul Dynasty, but he wasn't like a great player, but I guess he has some experience, so you can't really discount that. Same with Hagopun, who was with the London Spitfire and then went to Mayhem Academy and got promoted up. Has some Overwatch League experience, but obviously wasn't as good as other players on the London Spitfire roster, which is why he got released. Obviously, I mentioned Apply on that two-way contract. Don't expect to see a lot of him, so it's whatever. One of my issues comes in here with BQB, who is a DPS player. I have not seen anything from him that wasn't Sombra. He plays mostly Sombra, and Sombra is kind of not in the best spot right now. She's not horrible, but I don't really think she's a fantastic fantastic hero right now, so a little concerned there. Chris, I'm pretty excited to see what he does. I don't know if he'll play over Hagopun or Hagopun will play over Chris. I'm excited to see what Chris does, but I think Chris is someone who will most likely by the end of the season be the starter, but I don't know. Then you have Swan in that tank role. Don't expect to see him a lot because I expect SNT to play the most, but this team to me is just, it's better than last season, but I don't think it was enough to be a really big title contender. I think they're still missing some of the parts that you need. I think the fact they didn't do an organizational change is concerning to me. I think some of the teams you look at the Shanghai Dragons, they did an entire overhaul of the team. The team is very different now because they struggled. The Florida Mayhem were not much better than the Shanghai Dragons, and they didn't really change a lot. They kept most of the team staff. So I'm just a little kind of iffy on this team and the way they've kind of evolved and changed. I don't really think that they have done enough to become all of a sudden title contenders. I think that in general, you kind of basically, you improve your roster in terms of skill, but you also reset in terms of chemistry. So you have to work that out. You don't really have players who come from a team together. You have Tavik, Saya player, and SNT, who of course played for the Florida Mayhem last season, so they've played together, but Zephyr and Hagopun didn't play together recently. Chris comes from Meta Athena, so he didn't play with BQB, because BQB is coming from X6. Swan is coming from NRG. They're all coming from all over the place. There's no real chemistry there. I'm a little concerned about the way this team has been built, and that's why I have them down here at 18. That's really all I got. That's how I'm feeling. All right, up here at number 17, I have the Boston Uprising. A bit of a drop for the team that was number 3 in the league overall last season, but the loss of Striker and mistakes in that DPS role means they had to restart there, and of course they lost Dream Casper mid-season, which had its own set of repercussions there. Plus they lose Neko, who while wasn't the best player, was still a solid player and still knew what he was doing. He was their starter for a large part of the season. You lose a lot of players like that. You have to replace pretty much half of your roster. It's not going to go as well as you most likely want it to, and I don't think they did well, let's just say that they, in my opinion, struggled to replace their players. They keep Gamsu in that main tank role, who I think is a good main tank player. I don't think he's an amazing main tank player. I don't think he's bad. I think he's good. I think he does his job well. I think he plays well enough. He's done what he's needed to do, so I like Gamsu in that role. Note on that flex tank, essentially Diva. Note is the best player on this team now, so I have no issues there. You have Kellex on the main support role. I'm not crazy about Kellex. I thought he was kind of average last season. You have Aim God on that Zenyatta role, essentially. He was okay. He's replacing Neko. He was on the team last season as well, so he's still there. And those are the 4 you keep, and then you're keeping, I think, some of the weaker parts of your roster. Obviously, the really weak parts they let go of, but you're kind of keeping the weaker parts of this roster at the end of the day. Then you add Blase and Color Hex in DPS. You have to deal with Color Hex being suspended for the first 2 games, so that won't go very well for them. I don't think it will, at least. They have Axiom in that main tank role, who I don't think will play much, because they're rid of Gamsu, and I don't expect Axiom to replace him. They have Fusions on a 2-way contract. I mean, I think that's mostly for the academy team, but also I think they know that if he's on a 2-way contract, he won't be able to then sign with another team, and they kind of want to make sure they can have him in case they eventually want him. Then they have Alamau in that support role. Once again, a player I don't think will play much, because I think Kellex will most likely be playing most of the season, but can't be too sure, so that's what I look at with this team. What I give this team the benefit of over the Florida Mayhem is the Florida Mayhem I don't think have that talent in the same way that the Boston Uprising do, and the Boston Uprising succeeded last season when they were a weaker team. Now they don't have their head coach that they had. They don't really have a head coach anymore. Their former head coach Krusty left and joined the San Francisco Shock, and I think the San Francisco Shock are going to be a better team this season now that they have him. I have a lot of questions surrounding this team. They open up their season against the New York Excelsior and the Houston Outlaws, who are 2 teams that I think are better than them, obviously. So it's going to be a tough opening. I mean, I look at a lot of their Stage 1 games. I wouldn't be surprised if they went 1 win in Stage 1, maybe 2 wins. I don't think this team is great. I think they have some serious issues in terms of some of the players they have, in terms of skill. I think they're lacking in DPS specifically. And if they're going to add another DPS player, I hope they do it soon, because the season starts very soon. So I have some issues with this team. That's why I have them this low. But if they end up kind of rising like they did last season, where no one really thought they'd be anything, and they were one of the top teams in the league, I wouldn't be surprised either, because I think you have to give credit to a team that can do that once. Probably a good chance they can do it again. But next is number 16. And at number 16, I have the Atlanta Reign. Now, why I put the Atlanta Reign above the Boston Uprising is quite simple. I think they just have more talent than the Boston Uprising do. Not by a lot. I think it's very, very small. But where they, I think, have a lot more talent is DPS, which I think is going to be very important now that it seems like Dive is somewhat back and Goats is mostly gone. I think that they have one of the best players in that DPS, just like mechanical raw skill in Defran. He's also kind of a reason why I'm concerned about this team, because who knows if he will be a player that lasts. Who knows how long he'll kind of roll with the team. One of the issues I do have with this team is they have 8 players only, and one of those players is a 2-way player in Gator. So really, on a daily basis, they have 7 players, and the only position that they have a backup in is DPS. So if Kodak and Masa or Dako, Popo, if any of them kind of start to struggle, you don't have a lot of leeway. You don't have a lot of room um, to replace players or to put other players in because, well, that's all you have, right? You're running out of players, and it's where I'm kind of concerned. But what I like about this team is that it's a very, very diverse group that will, I think, find a good way to work with each other, but it's also kind of problematic. It's diverse rosters are both good and bad. It's good because if you play on a diverse roster, that helps you out a ton. If you build a diverse roster and it works, you can add any player. But if you build a diverse roster and it doesn't work, well, then you're stuck with a group that don't communicate well. So it's always kind of a wild card thing to do, and I need to see a diverse roster work before I start to give the team credit for it. So if this diverse roster works and the team plays well, then of course give them all the credit in the world. If it doesn't work, you're going to have to kind of dock them for it, in my opinion. So that's what I'm most concerned about with this Atlanta Reign team is how well this diverse roster will work. And you never really know what to expect. And especially, you'll notice that most of the teams so far have been expansion teams. I guess not most of them. It's just just one more than the others. But I think being an expansion team is harder because you're not getting the same talent that a lot of these other teams are getting. The teams that were here before already got most of the best players, and now you kind of have to fill in some of those scraps and find places to add really good players, and it's a little bit harder. And I think the Atlanta Reign fell victim to that, where they didn't really have access to all the great players, so they're now kind of looking at their roster. They don't have any Overwatch League experience on the roster. I think that's a problem. So I'm concerned that they have Sephi as their head coach, which is kind of a interesting one because he was the head coach for the San Francisco Shock that they got rid of because he wasn't the best, and that's why they got rid of him. So or I don't know if he's the head coach, but he was a coach. But I think he was the head coach. So I'm very interested in seeing how this Atlanta Reign team does, but I think there's just a couple things about them that I'm not super sold on, and that's why I have them down here at number 16. Next, at number 15, I have the Guangzhou Charge. Now, what the Guangzhou Charge do right is they built a very, very, very good roster with some Overwatch League experience with only one player, and it's Hotba, but Hotba was successful. They signed some players who found success in the Overwatch League or in the Overwatch World Cup, in Kib mainly, but also you have Only Wish and Eileen from China. I don't believe Eileen was on the neither of those were on the World Cup team, but they both are just they're known players in my eyes, so they're easier to just recognize. But Kiv mainly is the one with the Overwatch World Cup experience. But this is a diverse roster that I like for one reason, and it's because I know they have someone who has played on a diverse roster before, and that's Hotba. My problems lie in the fact that it's a predominantly South Korean roster, but your DPS role, you have to run someone that is not a South Korean player. You have Happy, you have Kib, you have Nero, you have Eileen. Happy's from South Korea, Eileen's from China, Kib is from the UK, and Nero is from the US. So early on, you won't have Nero because Nero won't be able to play right away because his birthday is in May. He turns 18 at the end of May. So he won't be playing for a little while. So it's really between Eileen and Kib, I think, for that spot. And in terms of when you look at the way they play and what they play, Happy is, just to start with him, a hit scan player, while Kib is more of a flex DPS player, as is Eileen. So I expect Eileen to play more, but I think Kib has a deeper hero pool. So if there's other heroes they need, they'll put Kib in. But that's where I'm kind of is you have a bunch of Korean players, and I like that, but you have to run players that aren't Korean at times. And I can see issues arising with that. But I don't think they're a bad team because I think that the players they do have in those DPS roles are good players, and in some ways DPS can be independent because if you have a DPS player who's kind of off doing his own thing, if they're doing their job, it doesn't really matter. I expect Hotba to be a very big part of this team in terms of communicating and translating and getting information to every player on this team. So I don't really get that concerned about this team's potential issues in communication due to it being a diverse roster. I just think that in general the team is kind of underwhelming when compared to some of the other teams. I think they have good players and they have good talent. Obviously, I have them somewhat high on this list. Well, I guess not somewhat high on this list, but they're at 15, so they're not a trash tier team. But I think that they have some necessity in terms of communication and getting communication very quick and accurate and precise. That could obviously be an issue when you have different languages and different accents. Like you have two people that speak English natively, but one person speaks British English and one person speaks American English with a British accent versus an American accent. There's some issues in there, and I can see some communication issues potentially arising. I think every team has communication issues in some games, but I think the more variables you add to languages, the more issues you're going to run into. So that's why I have the Guangzhou charge here, because I see potential problems with communication that may stop them, and I don't think that their roster is so star-studded that they're going to just show out and show up and show off all the time. So that's why I have them down here at number 15. Up next, we have number 14, where I have the Toronto Defiant. Now, I really like the Toronto Defiant, mainly because I believe in their head coach, Bishop, who was the head coach at one point for the London Spitfire. They also have Winston's Lab as an analyst, and I think that is a very good person to have as your analyst because he has essentially just spent years now on stats online, so he knows what he's looking at and he knows his stuff. Players, you have some Overwatch League experience with Envy and Neko and Asher. Now, Asher didn't play a lot, but he still has at least some experience. Envy, of course, was on the LA Valiant, didn't really play a lot, but he was on the team. Neko, of course, was the flex support for the Boston Uprising. He's also a problem for this team because he is suspended for a while to start the season because he attempted to obstruct League Office investigation. So he's suspended for the first 3 games of the season, which is almost half of the first stage. So that's a problem. And they don't have another player to play that role. So when you have to play Houston, Atlanta, and the LA Valiant without a player on your team who's pretty important, and then immediately after he comes back, his first game back is against the New York Excelsior, there's some problems there, I think, that could lead to an early struggle that it may become harder to overcome. But I like Bishop and his abilities as a coach. I think he knows what he's doing when he put this team together. I wouldn't be surprised if they're the dark horse team that people are sleeping on, and they just come out and they just kill it and start doing really well. They're in the Atlantic, a division I find weaker. I think that helps them out a lot in getting potentially making that push into the playoffs, potentially through that tournament at the end of the season that you have to win if you want to get in to the playoffs, to be the last 2 playoff teams. I really think Toronto has the ability to do that, but I think they might have some struggles early on that are hard to overcome with suspensions and a relatively tough early schedule. I mean, Valiant early on, I guess it's good to get some of those tough games out of the way right away because it means you don't have to worry about you're gonna, if you're playing a game that you're probably gonna lose anyway and you're not at full strength, well then that's better. I just have some questions about this team, and I think you have to you can't put them too high because at the end of the day they haven't found tons of success with these players in the past. So while I think they are a dark horse team and they could do very, very well, they're a pure South Korean roster made by the same guy who essentially built the London Spitfire. you kind of have to keep in mind the fact that they are somewhat weak, and in that way, you kind of have to be concerned about their potential success in the league. That's why I have them down here at number 14. At 13, I have the Dallas Fuel. They were a good team last season. They played well in Stage 4 especially. They've had some major changes to their team. Specifically, they lost Seagull, they lost Chip Sayan and Coco, two players who were pretty good, and then Seagull, who was a very, very good player, and who was basically the leader of this team. So you lose that experience with Seagull, and you gain some things that are pretty good. They were a successful team in Stage 4 without Effect, who was probably their best DPS player, and you get him back now, and he will likely be the starter for this team. You have Taimu as well. We'll see how he plays when you have a lot of DPS players now. You have Taimu, you have Effect, you still have AKM on this team, and now you have Zachary on this team. You have 4 really solid DPS players. I guess I'll say 3 really solid DPS players. AKM is good, but I don't know if he'll be, playing as often now that Effect and Zachary are on the roster. I love OG in that tank role. I like Closer now in that support role. I don't expect to see a lot of RCK on that flex tank role, but there are still some questions about Mickey, and now that Brigitte's not as strong, maybe we start to see more RCK. Mickey, to me, wasn't as great on D.Va as even Seagull was, and Seagull was a DPS player, though I guess he was kind of a flex player because he played a little bit of everything. This team is kind of at an interesting point. They were a good team last season. I kind of wanted to put them a lot higher, but I'm in this really weird spot with this season where I look at the teams basically on my list 16 through 9 are all super close, and any of them could be up or any of them could be down. But I put the Dallas Fuel here because I'm just a little bit concerned about the fact that they were really bad in the early points of Season 1, and I think that the meta of Stage 4 just worked for them. I don't know if they'll be able to continue that success now that the meta is going to be different again. So I don't like to say, this team had one good stage. Well, that means they're going to be a much better team this season. Everyone thought Dallas Fuel was going to be really good last season, and by the end of the season, people would have been like, yeah, there's the Dallas Fuel we know. But at the same time, they didn't play very well most of the season. That, to me, is kind of a sign that maybe we were wrong about them. They're not as good as people thought. So for that reason, I have them here in spot 13. I think they're a good team. I think they're a solid team. I think they're a much better team than they were last season. But the loss of Seagull, to me, is one of the keys here because he's a veteran. He had that veteran leadership presence. I wonder what they'll be without him. And that's what I need to see before I start to say, yes, this team is really good, or I go, this team's not that great. So that's why I have them here at 13. Let's move on to number 12. I have a very interesting team here at number 12, I think. I was kind of surprised when I was doing my rankings and I put them at 12, but the more I think about it, I still think it's a really good position, and that's the Paris Eternal. Paris Eternal, 2 fantastic star DPS players in Soon and Shadowburn right off the bat. Soon, one of the best Widowmakers from Season 1, one of the best hitscan players, coming from the LA Valiant, going to Paris Eternal, playing for the city that he is, that is his home, right? He's a French player. He wanted to play for Paris because they're his country's team. You have Shadowburn, of course, played for the Philadelphia Fusion, didn't get a lot of playtime, sat mostly behind EQO, but most people would sit behind EQO. EQO is a very good player. But of course, he's very good on Genji specifically. So I'm excited to see Shadowburn in a much bigger role. This, of course, is the purely European roster that this season of Overwatch League brings us. My concern with this team comes primarily in the tank role, the main tank role. Now, I could, of course, be very wrong about this. Maybe the selection of games that I watched wasn't the best, but both LH Cloudy and Ben Best never really impressed me on their main tank roles when I watched them. I thought they were good, but also a little bit weak at times. And I wasn't crazy about them when I watched them. So that is the thing that makes me kind of skeptical about their main tank role. You have Fincy in that flex tank role, who was on the LA Valiant but didn't really play because he wasn't incredible. He wasn't awful, but he wasn't incredible. Um, I want to say Nico GDH. It was either Nico GDH or Danye. One of them in Contenders played a lot of Diva. I don't remember exactly which one, but I was impressed by their Diva that I saw in Contenders, so you have some room there. I want to say it was Nico GDH more than I want to say it was Danye, because I'm pretty sure it was Nico. But I think that they have players that can kind of flex around, which I really like. I really like Hip and Cruz in that support role. Hip, when I watched, I was a lot more impressed by his Zenyatta than his Moira, if I remember correctly. So if Zenyatta's played a lot, then Hip will be better. But his Moira, I remember being just not all that great. But Cruz, I think, is really good in that main support role. I don't expect Gray to play a lot, but I expect him to get some play time. As a whole, I think this team is solid. I just think that the European Overwatch scene, while good, is not the best scene. I don't even. It's probably number 3, but China's also been getting very good recently, so Europe might be the 4th best scene. So even if you have a roster comprised of the best players in every role from your region, which I don't think they do, I don't really think Europe is the strongest region, and that is a part of why they're down here. Um, at 12, but 12 is still a very good spot. I think this team is a very solid team, and I'm really excited to see Soon and Shadowburn on the same team and how they play together, because I think they will be incredible together, and I think this DPS will be one of the best DPS cores in the league. It's just I need to see this team in action to really get a feeling for them, and that's part of why I have them here. I trust their head coach, Damon. He knows a lot of these French players. He coached the French team. I expect this team personally to do very well and to be very good, but my questions always will come in to whether or not this team can be as good as they can be with a purely European roster. How good is a purely European roster going to be when compared to some of these purely South Korean rosters and some of these predominantly American rosters? I think Europe as a scene isn't quite at the same place as a lot of these regions, so they might struggle for that reason, but I really like a lot of the players on this team, so I give them the number 12 spot because I think they have enough solid players that they can do pretty well. Finally, for this part 1 video, we have the number 11 spot where I have the Hangzhou Spark. Now, the Hangzhou Spark, I really like this team. Gushui and Crystal, of course, both coming from China. The roster is predominantly South Korean, but they have 2 Chinese players in Crystal and Gushui, both of whom played for the Korean World Cup team. Gushui, specifically, is possibly the 3rd best main tank in the world right now. He is one of the best main tanks in the world right now, I would argue. Like, he's up there, top 5, definitely top 10. He's incredible. Now, will he play more than No Smite, who is from South Korea and has, of course, some level of chemistry with other players on this team, coming from X6 Gaming, and he's not the only player on this team coming from X6. So you have some chemistry there with other players, such as Rhea. He's one of the flex players. He's like a flex tank player. So you have that tank line that has chemistry if you play No Smite over Gushui, but you could also just play other people in general, because this team is a mix of multiple teams. It's not just X6. There's also a bunch of players from 7. It's an interesting team. Predominantly South Korean, with some, of course, Chinese players in there, and mostly made up of 7 and X6 gaming, but once again, a couple other players in there as well. So I really like some of the players on this team, right? Gouchway especially. I can't praise Gouchway enough. My thing is, of course, this team doesn't have any players Overwatch League experience, so while these players were really, really good, and Gouchway to me and Crystal to me are the 2 players on this roster that I can say they have proven how good they are, because they took on some of the best players in the world, in the World Cup, and were successful. But I also think they were in one of the weaker group stages of the World Cup. When they beat Team Finland, I thought that was a very big win, and that showed how good they could be, and then they beat Team Canada. And that, once again, to me, showed they're a very solid team. They really struggled against Team South Korea. Right? So, now they have Korean players around them who know the South Korean scene a little bit more, but they're not the best South Korean players, right? They're not playing with, Carpe and Fleta. They're not playing with Meko, Jonak. They're playing with Korean players who are good players who played on teams in Contenders, one of the top scenes in Pro Overwatch. But they're not the best players. So while I think this is a solid roster, I need to see it in action, and I need to see how it matches up against some of these really good players that are in the Overwatch League. There are some really, really good teams with players that are some of the best players of their position. The New York Excelsior, the London Spitfire, the Philadelphia Fusion, the LA Gladiators even. The Seoul Dynasty have some of the best players in their positions on that roster. So I look at this team and I'm kind of a fan of everything they have going on, and their colors, of course. If this was a power ranking based on the team colors, they would be number 1. But where my issues lie is this team made up of enough solid players that they can make a push when they're in the Pacific Division, which to me is the harder division. You're in the harder division. You're playing against some of the really best players. You got Striker in your division. Obviously, you got Fissure in your division. You got Fleta in your division. You have Fate in your division. And there's some questions here that I don't know how good some of these players are. I don't know if some of these players are going to be the players that can carry this team far enough. And obviously I still have questions of, do you play No Smite for the chemistry? Do you play Gouchway for the solid play? I think Gouchway will play for the most part by the end of the season, but I don't know overall. I have some questions about this team. Not a lot, but some. And they have me putting this team down here at number 11. Still a very solid position. I think a team at number 11, of course, is a definite contender for the championship, or at least for making the playoffs. But I don't see them being a team that goes all the way and wins the whole thing. I think they're a solid team, but I don't really see them making a run for that title. But those are my thoughts on the first 10 teams for this power ranking. This video is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I'll try to keep it shorter for the next one. But just a quick little rundown, recap of where all of the teams are so far. At 20, we have the Chengdu Hunters. At 19, the Washington Justice. 18, the Florida Mayhem. 17, the Boston Uprising. 16, the Atlanta Reign. 15, the Guangzhou Charge. 14, the Toronto Defiant. 13, the Dallas Fuel. 12, the Paris Eternal. And 11, the Hangzhou Spark. So those are my thoughts on all these teams here. Part 2 of my power rankings will go up on Friday. So if you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps out a bunch. I will see you all Friday when part 2 goes up. So until then, enjoy, and I'll see you all in the next video.